This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be tuned in. We welcome you to another edition of the Vicars Crossing podcast. Vicars Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. My name is Rob Henderson, and I am the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church here in London, Ontario.
Hello, folks. My name is Kevin George, and I am the priest at St. Aidan's Anglican Church and the second vicar of the Vicars Crossing.
My name is Ian, and I haven't done enough schooling to classify myself as the third vicar of the Vicars Crossing.
You're an honorary vicar. You're not honorary. Yeah.
Producer, vicar, suave guy, overall good man. All that.
All right. And we have one more Zoom box to fill up in just a few minutes, as our guest will be joining us today. On this week's edition of the Vicars Crossing, we'll be welcoming scholar and author Robert P. Jones. And we're going to introduce him a little more formally coming up, but he's got a great book out that we commend to you, and we'll be talking a bit about his writing and work. There it is.
Look at that.
Too long?
Quite too long.
Yeah, so we're looking forward to chatting with Robert today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guys, as always, we always want to begin by mentioning our sponsors who are so generous to us and help us to be able to keep doing our podcast here. To A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And Dave Mullen and his staff, we wish you a good day and a thank you.
Shout out to Dave. Shout out to Carol Basada over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, a locally owned, locally operated, locally loved place. Run on over there and get all your pharmaceutical needs. Support local business.
Yeah. Speaking of local, we want to say a special thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Many thanks to Trisha Lister for that one too.
All right, Trisha.
All right. And speaking of healthy, so I'm in this spot. This is awful. This is where we're at. Is that I've got a little tickle, like a little cough.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I cough or make any noise or I sniff, everybody freaks out.
It's COVID.
I've got the COVID. So
Yeah.
I'm sipping my tea.
Yeah,
If I sound a little hoarse, I'm fine.
you don't
It's
look
just,
like a horse.
Yeah. Horse, of course. So everybody, I just want everybody to know things are fine here.
You don't have the
We're
COVID.
healthy. No, I don't have the COVID.
Hmm.
It's just a little sniffly thing going on, and I'm fine, and I feel good. Other than that, okay.
I have felt a little tickle in my throat the other day, and I took a Q-tip and shoved it up my nose, switched it around, and took it out and took a look. And I said, I don't have COVID. So we're good to go.
That's right. That's the home test, Kevin.
Yeah, I did
Kevin
know.
got the
Wow.
home test.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might have hurt my brain in the process, but what are you going to do? What are you going
All
to do?
right. Well, and we'll keep on our sickness theme here because it's time for everybody's favorite game show in the Vicars Crossing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sickness or Suds.
Oh,
Cheers.
Lordy. Cheers. Let's
Mm.
have a beer. What
Okay,
happens?
so
What happens?
I'll give you a little name or a word or phrase, and you have to tell me whether it's a sickness or a sud or a beer. Okay.
Okay.
So our word today is this:
Yeah.
Viking Sturker.
What? Wow.
The Viking Sturker. Sturker is spelled Sterkur. The Viking
Oh.
Sturker.
Viking
And if you know your history a little bit, this might help a little bit. So is Viking Sturker something you don't want to get because you don't want to pass it along to the family at dinner, or is it a delicious brew of some sort?
Wow.
Ian has a
Viking Sturker.
look
A
that he might
Viking
get this. The Viking
You know what? I feel like, and this is a big tangent here, I
Yeah.
feel like it's neither. I think Rob decided that he's gonna pick some random thing off a Viking ship, and it's
Yeah.
actually like the oars of the
It's like the
ship.
oars of the
That's what
ship.
they're called.
Wow,
Okay,
that
I
is
don't-
very creative. That's
Yeah.
good.
Just huge galaxy brain
It's
going
it's
off
awfully
out of the box right here.
it's I mean, I think as your day goes, it's early for you to be on the marijuana. I mean, so I don't think he's really on the marijuana, boys and girls, but I don't think so. I think it is a sickness that is some sort of nutritional issue because of all the sailing and
Right.
not getting the proper
Like
nutrition.
scurvy?
So
Yeah.
something like scurvy, like
Yeah,
not getting the
scurvy.
proper, like that.
That
Right,
would have been
right.
my answer if I wasn't so galaxy brain.
Well, when I first saw it, yeah, I mean, that's if you know your history, the Vikings came over from Norway or wherever and came and
Yep.
they brought all this stuff
Yep.
and we're still dealing with it, right? Years later. And to a rational person, that would be true, but actually it's a beer.
I'm
Wow.
irrational. I'm
Yes,
irrational.
it's a beer. Viking Sturker is a beer that is brewed in Iceland,
Oh,
Ooh.
and the word Sturker means strong or bold.
Oh.
So it's like,
like a
yeah,
stout.
it comes in, it's a stout and it comes in
I
different
see.
different flavors. And tannins.
Viking
Yeah.
Sturker.
So yeah, look for
Sturker.
Viking Sturker in your
We
in
should
your
go get
nearest
some,
beer
guys.
store. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna go ask for Viking Sturker at the beer store.
That's pretty
Yeah.
cool, huh?
Yeah, I like that.
All right, so that's sickness or suds, and it's time now for
Ask anything.
Ask Ian anything. Kevin, do we have a question today?
We do. Today's question comes from beautiful Manitoba,
Ooh.
from Verdun, Manitoba.
Ooh.
And one of our listeners out there, Ron. Ron is wondering out in Verdun. Is that right? I'm not saying it. Verdun, isn't it?
We're done. Yeah, I think
Verdun.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, Verdun. But my apologies to our Verdun listeners and constituency for getting the name messed up a minute ago. And Ron, most especially to you, I apologize. So Ron in Verdun has a very important question for Ian, and that question
Yeah.
is: free agency has just been upon us in the hockey world. You are a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. What are you most excited about in terms of what the Maple Leafs did in the last week? That would, of course, assume that you watched any of it.
And I didn't. So here's
right.
an answer that I'm gonna pull out of absolutely nowhere. It's
Ron is a Maple Leafs fan. Obviously.
Why wouldn't Ron be a Winnipeg Jets fan?
Probably because they left for a time. I don't know.
That's fair, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know anything that's going on with the trading world at all.
Okay. All right.
So,
right. Well,
actually, I did. Sorry, change it to speak of trading. I saw a clip where, someone from San Jose was getting drafted or something like that,
Uh-huh.
and they signed the name of who was being drafted because that person's mother was deaf, and I was like, oh, that's really cool to see.
Okay. So see,
But
it says, well, here's what I'm going to answer that one for you. I'm going to
Do it.
say,
yeah,
I'm going to say I like their signing of Wayne Simmons best because I think he's a bit of a hardworking guy, and I think he'll be a good addition to the Leafs. But never mind. What about the Red Wings, Robbie? How do you like what the Red Wings have done over the last couple of days?
Yeah, they signed a free agent from their best pickup, I thought, was Vlad Namestnikov. I can never pronounce his name properly.
Yeah.
I think he's from Colorado,
Nemesnikov.
right? Yeah,
Yeah,
Nemesnikov. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who was he's related to former Red Wing.
Oh, like Vlad
Yeah.
or Igor Larionov?
Was it Igor Larionov or one of the?
Could be one of the big
Anyway,
ones.
that was
Yeah.
a good pickup, and they drafted pretty well. And Steve Yzerman picked up a few low-cost free agents on short-term deals, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah.
So it was. I think people are buzzing a little bit that, in Stevie we trust for
That's
our Red
right,
Wing
yeah.
fans. That he did a great job in Tampa when he was there, and he knows how to build a winner. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be, I think, a lot better for them.
I like Thomas Grease. They signed Thomas Grease as a goalie.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
That was another one, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So all good. What about you and your
Well,
habitant?
this is the first time. I mean, listen, Marc Bergevin, the general manager of the Montreal Canadiens, has gone into the season with $10 million of cap space for the last 2 or 3 years. And this will be the first year we're going in with zero. He's actually
Oh wow.
gone out and made acquisitions and signed people. He signed but the one I'm most excited about, he added Jake Allen as a backup, which we needed. Carey was playing 72 games, too many.
Wow.
Too many games for a guy. So we have really a very solid goaltending tandem now, probably the best in the league. And I was really excited about signing a Tyler Toffoli. Great, hardworking, hard-nosed kid. A couple of Stanley Cups in LA. Excited for Toffoli. So there you have it.
You're saying a bunch of names that I am not familiar with.
Don't let it be said that the Vicars Crossing is only about religion.
Right. Right. Iain, get
About
on to
much more
Google.
than
Get
that.
on to Google and start finding out who these people are.
Right. Of course.
And you know, probably we should say, getting off of that, but before we switch over to Robbie here, Jones, that the other thing we should remind people of is you'll be listening to this on Wednesday. Wednesday nights, Canadians Praying for Americans. It's happening at 9:30 p.m. If you'd like to join us, send us an email. We'll hook you up. We've got over 120 people registered from coast to coast in most of the provinces. Tonight's guest is Robert P. Jones. No, that's our guest on the thing. Pastor Carl Day is
There
our
it is.
guest tonight from Philadelphia on the Canadians Praying for Americans. And we have music from his honorable here, Ian Stevenson.
Oh, I'm the honorable now.
Yeah. And we also have music from Luminous Voices, a professional choir in Calgary, which just 2 weeks ago went to a church, Calgary Anglican church, socially or physically distanced, wore mask, and recorded this beautiful piece of music that we're going to use at this session as well.
Nice.
So join us.
Nice. All right. Looking forward to
Sweet.
that. Okay. Our guest is going to be joining us in just a couple of minutes. We're just hooking him up to our Zoom room here in the Vicars Crossing. I know Ian's going to step away for a bit because he's got a bit of a conflict here. So we'll be checking in with him again. All right, Iain?
Yeah.
So you have a good rest of the day, and let's push a few buttons. Before you go, make sure you push the right button. And we are back with the Vicars Crossing into our Zoom room. We are thrilled to welcome our guest for this week. Robert P. Jones is with us. His friends call him Robbie, so we're going to now consider ourselves friends. Robbie, welcome to the Vicars Crossing. So glad you're here.
Oh, thanks. I'm thrilled to be here.
I feel excited because I have two Robbies on the same screen.
There you go.
There you go.
I've known this guy for years, and that's all I call him is Robbie.
It's
So
Robbie.
that's
That's right.
So
That's
if
right.
you both answer to me at the same time, it'll be great.
And Robbie's in the hotbed of it all. He's joining us from Washington today. So we're really thrilled to have you, and I want to talk a bit about your book coming up and some other things going on as we get closer and closer to the election in just a couple of weeks from now. So Kevin, would you give a formal introduction to our guest, please?
I would be glad to. Robert P. Jones is the CEO and founder of PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, and is a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He's the author of White Too Long, which I have right here. It's a great book, I'd say. And also The End of White Christian America, right here. Also a very good book. I got to learn. My wife tells me I got to learn to wait till they come out in paperback, but I love the hardback. So there you go. The End of White Christian America actually won the 2019 Grawemeyer. Am I saying that right? No,
I think it's Grawemeyer.
Grawemeyer Award in Religion. This is the second guest who's done that because Rob, I think Stephen J. Patterson also won that award for his work around Paul's Creed. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, religion for The Atlantic Online, NBC Think, and other outlets. You'll see him on major media outlets such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, but even more impressively, the Vicars Crossing. This is a man who's got his finger on the pulse of what's going on in terms of where faith intersects with the public square, which is really the work that PRRI is doing, and makes him the ideal guest for the work that we're trying to do here on the Vicars Crossing as we talk about faith and its intersectionality with the public square. So we're glad you're with us, Robbie. You're an incredible person doing incredible work, and your voice is critical for what's happening right now. So welcome.
Thanks.
Let's just start with what is most immediate, if we can. I think you were saying as we were getting set up here that if you look out the window, you can see the White House. So you're right in the thick of some stuff this week. there's some goings on in Washington. First of all, it feels like every day there is like a week long. The news
Yeah.
cycle is so intense. It's unbelievable. We're still trying to get our heads here around the whole situation with Donald Trump and COVID and the super spreader at the White House and Senate members now coming in after having been sick and so on. The Supreme Court nomination, the confirmation hearings are underway for Amy Coney Barrett. Now, beyond the fact that the Republicans have decided to just ignore everything they did when Barack Obama was trying to nominate Merrick Garland, and they're going to ram this thing through, it sounds like before the election. There are some fascinating intersections of faith in the public square as it relates to her. We see in the ads, we get them here in Canada too, believe it or not, because we have so much American TV that, there's the ad which is saying she's being attacked for being a Roman Catholic. They get John F. Kennedy on there and so on. But there's also those and those are obviously in favor of her confirmation. And there are others that are saying, that this is about dogmatics and about somebody being so dogmatized that they're unable to have any objectivity when it comes to the public and the decisions around the law. Is her faith fair game in this confirmation hearings? Can you share your reflections on where things are at and what you're seeing there?
Yeah, well, I think it's I'm going to give that "it depends" answer. Because I think that what's really relevant, are her views on the issues and her record, and what that means for how she's likely to vote on any number of things, that have come up. I mean, we've just had, obviously the Roe v. Wade abortion decision is kind of on the table here. That's the one that's getting talked about the most. But we also just had the Supreme Court have two dissenting opinions on marriage equality that look like it might be trying to set the table for a future court to revisit the 2015 Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage in the U.S. Yeah. There's the Affordable Care Act. There's any number of things that are there. And what kind of strings all these things together, interestingly enough, is that in the public, there's actually 2/3 support for marriage equality in the U.S. today. There is overwhelming support for the Affordable Care Act, and particularly for protecting pre-existing conditions. There is 6 in 10 support for abortion in the country today, including, by the way, among majorities of Catholics. I think that's the thing that isn't quite talked about that much. But despite the fact that the Catholic Church itself has staked out a position, that doesn't reflect the views of American Catholics by and large, who are a majority in support of, and they're also majority of Catholics, by the way, in support of same-sex marriage in the U.S. today. So I think one of the challenges is that these issues are there. But to your question about religion, I think, it's certainly not, we have an official no religious test for office, guarantee in the U.S. I think that's super important to pay attention to. There should be no exceptions, conservative, liberal, whatever, on that. That shouldn't be the test. But I think, how she rules and why she might rule the way she rules, I think those questions, are certainly fair game.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because, obviously, just taking what you just said about the fact that so many Roman Catholics, for instance, would have a more progressive or liberal stance, say, on gay marriage, or same-sex marriage, just to take one example. I think what a lot of people, at least the way we've been reading it, what we see in the media anyway, is that she has been involved with some pretty, should we say, more extreme versions of Roman Catholicism, in terms of having a more conservative, hardline sort of theology or dogmatics, and that she's spoken about these things in the past, I guess, and I guess that's sort of where the rub comes in. At what point and how do these? It's an interesting process. We don't have it like this. Nobody in Canada could tell you who any of our Supreme Court justices are, because it's not political. It's based on jurisprudence, sort of, So, but watching it, it's quite fascinating to me to process So I just wonder, like, I mean, it must be a fine line to walk, where there's this, as you say, there's no religious litmus test. Yet there are these religious convictions that she clearly has that could be so instructive to how she rules on Roe versus Wade or same sex. And I saw that minority opinion from Justice Thomas, and I forget, but and so it must be a difficult line to walk.
I think that's right. But I think what you said is maybe the key to it is, where she has put her faith in public, in her own previous, public remarks, where she has signed on, like in at least one case, signed on to a pro-life, document. I think that then puts it into the public domain, right? So she had lived her entire life with her own sense that no, my religion is private. I've not let it intrude on any of my public decisions or any of my public statements. I think that's one thing, but I think where she herself has put it into the public domain, I think that certainly opens the door to ask at least specifically about those things and whether those things would then carry over to future decisions.
Interesting.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you about the orange glow that occupies the house down from where you are working right now.
We sound like we have an opinion, Rob.
No, not
Yeah,
at
right.
all. Not at all. So one of the conversations is always around our dinner table and around our church when we talk about Donald Trump is this. It's difficult to fathom the support that he enjoys from those who purport to be Christian, right? And there's this disconnect that we have that we can't get our heads around. We're seeing 80% of evangelical white Christians still strongly behind the president. In your book, White Too Long, that Kevin held up, you point out that Trump also enjoyed support from Christians across the board, really. There it is. So Trump's gone from kind of blowing dog whistles to racists to being overt about his racism. He won't deny white supremacists. That was the news. It seems so long ago, but it was only about a week and a half ago that was top of mind. So I wonder if you could just say more about how this plays a role in the support of President Trump, how he enjoys that in kind of white Christian community. And are you finding in your surveys that he's even losing any support among white Christians right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the question that has come at me that I've done more thinking about, since 2016 than any single question, for sure. And here's what I think. I actually wrote about this in the afterword of the paperback edition of The End of White Christian America, which Kevin, you don't have.
I should have waited
because you've got the hardback.
Yeah.
But kind of, I had the luxury of kind of reflecting back on. So The End of White Christian America came out the summer before the election in 2016, and then the paperback came out the summer after the election. So I was able to kind of reflect back on there. And, what I argued there is that what we really saw among white evangelicals is Trump kind of, I won't transform might be too strong, maybe revealed that white evangelicals weren't just what their own kind of word for it was values voters, right? That we vote our values, we vote for candidates that share our values. I mean, that was the line during the Bush years, and particularly in the anti-Clinton years. And then and what I've argued is that they kind of have, Trump has revealed them to not just be that, but really to be enamored and to be really powered and motivated more by what I call nostalgia voters. And that is kind of looking back to a previous time in the country when it was more friendly to them. It was demographically a country that looked more like them. That is more white and Christian than it is today. It was on a whole race of issues such as same-sex marriage, which talked about, for example, the country. I mean, really in the U.S., I mean, as recently as, a decade ago, the country was more with the views of white evangelicals than it is today, right? That we have, even among white evangelicals, even younger white evangelicals support marriage equality today. So even their own, the children of kind of the founders of the Christian right aren't with them on that. So I think as they saw the country demographically changing, no longer being a majority white Christian country in the last 10 years, and things like same-sex marriage really being removed really from being even a controversial issue as majorities of Americans came to support it. Trump's appeal, that "Make America Great Again," right? That last word, I think, was really as powerful as anything else in that sentence, because it was this hearkening back to, okay, well, let's go back and Trump talked to them like that. If you listen to those final speeches in the campaign from 2016, I mean, Trump was saying things like, look, you're never going to see a candidate like me again, folks. If you don't elect me this time, the country's going to change beyond recognition. And I'm the only thing standing between you and that change. I mean, that was his final closing argument in the 2016 campaign. And I think it's been pretty effective. I mean, you know, so it's also important to remember white evangelicals absolutely are the most supportive, but it's also been other white Christian groups. So white mainline Protestants, you know, that includes Episcopalians and Presbyterians and the like. I mean, they nearly 6 in 10 white mainline Protestants supported Trump in 2016, and white Catholics was more than 6 in 10 white Catholics supported Trump in 2016. So it was a kind of more of a white Christian problem or issue, and that's really remained mostly true. You know, we have seen very little fall off in favorability. I mean, you know, now like things like impeachment seem like such a distant memory. It hasn't even come up in the presidential debates. I mean, it's so far back there. It's like really amazing.
He's been impeached, and there's no talk of it in the debates at all.
No. I mean, and so, you know, it's been remarkable to study. You know, so the white evangelicals are still there. Not only will they vote for him, but more than 7-10 actually have a favorable opinion of him. You know, and his favorability has remained in positive numbers among other white Christian groups as well, white mainliners and white Catholics. It has dropped among those two groups, it's sort of like basically divided among white Catholics, and it's a little bit majority territory for white mainline Protestants, while it's like 7 and 10 for white evangelicals. But there has been no huge fall off. Like he's not underwater with those groups,
which is sort of shocking, really. I mean, but it gets carried forward too, because now he's saying things like, you know, they're coming for your homes in the suburbs, and they're, you know, I mean, it's pretty overt. And you know, you got these poor young like young people like that young fellow Rittenhouse or whatever, Kyle, who went out and took a gun and killed 2 people. 17 years old, his life is ruined, but it's Christian groups that are raising $750,000 for his defense. You know, I mean, it's shocking to me in a way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's you know, that even I think these other movements, as you said, I mean, we've now seen not just in Charlottesville, where the president refused to condemn white supremacist groups, but just, you know, during the president, right on the floor of a presidential debate, you know, not only refused to condemn them, but named, you know, the Proud Boys by name and said, stand back and stand by, you know, was his remark there. And it took him, it's a similar pattern like that both in Charlottesville and in the debate. In both cases, it took him 48 hours to say anything else. And then he did, you know, basically read a statement that clearly someone else wrote, you know, and kind of did say the right words, but it took him 48 hours in both cases to finally say the right words. When he's on his feet, it's really clear. And what's remarkable today is that we actually have, in our latest surveys at PRRI, nearly 6 in 10 Americans today say that the president's speech and behavior has encouraged white supremacist groups. Say that outright about a sitting president of the United States, and yet that doesn't really have the huge, you know, push against white Christians. And it kind of goes to the thesis of my book in a way, right? That this still sits fairly comfortably within the kind of worldview of kind of white Christianity in the country.
Well, we had a.
Go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to say, we had a guest on, Kevin will have to refresh my memory, that made an interesting point about that oftentimes you'll hear, or mostly all the time, you'll hear the white Christian groups talk about God, but never about Jesus.
And
that's kind of Pavlovich, John Pavlovich was mentioning that to us, it's about God, and Jesus never shows up in the conversation, despite the fact that it's Christianity, right?
Well, yeah, his point was that it's hard to square the actions of white supremacy with Jesus.
Right.
But if you quote enough Old Testament, you can sort of get your head around it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's funny. I might actually take issue with that. I mean, you know,
I thought you might, based on what I read in your books. That's a great question,
I mean,
Rob.
No, I think it's important here because, you know, I mean, I'll make this really personal. I mean, if there was anything that I heard, so I should say I grew up in the deep South in Mississippi, mostly in Jackson, Mississippi, as a Southern Baptist, right? That's the largest evangelical denomination. It's actually the largest Protestant denomination of any kind, but it's by far the largest evangelical denomination in the country. And so I grew up as a kid in the 70s and 80s there. And, if there was anything I heard every single service, it was about a personal relationship with Jesus. I heard that every time. What I heard nothing about was civil rights, racial injustice. And this was despite the fact that I'm in Jackson, Mississippi in the 1970s, right?
Yeah,
So I experienced actually the integration of my public schools. Like the first Black kids showed up at my public school in the early 1970s. That's nearly 2 decades after the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision. So my home state drug its feet for like 2 decades.
2 decades.
But despite the fact that, so here I am, a white kid, seeing these Black kids show up at my school, and there was not one syllable uttered about that at my church, right? Despite the fact that we were talking about Jesus all the time.
Right.
And in fact, I think, it depends on, which I have a line in the book that I think, I'm going to paraphrase it here. But it's basically, it says, that the light-skinned Jesus that most white churches conjured, and was hanging on the wall, right? This kind of picture of a white Jesus is hanging on the wall of many American churches, at least, was not only indifferent to segregation and slavery and white supremacy, he actually demanded its defense. That's the white Jesus. So I think it means, the question is, which Jesus are we talking about?
Well, that's actually quite good. And so that takes me to the next question, which is really around, and I'll read a piece. It's similar to what you're just talking about out of your book. In White Too Long, you write, the historical record of lived Christianity in America reveals that Christian theology and institutions have been the central cultural tentpole, which I love this image, but the central cultural tentpole holding up the very idea of white supremacy. And the genetic imprint of this legacy remains present and measurable in contemporary white Christianity, not only among evangelicals in the South, but also amongst mainline Protestants in the Midwest and Catholics in the Northeast. Now, as you say, this is the central premise of your book. Not that it's not just that some folks are racist, or that folks are, well, we're not racist if we can't see it, if it's not overt. It's that the church has been systemically racist, and that it's that central cultural tentpole that's sort of holding up white supremacy. You contend that there needs to be a reckoning with white supremacy and the willful ignorance that goes with it, and the amnesia of, well, we just don't need to remember any of that. I find that actually, reading your book, very helpful, even in the Canadian context. A lot of it revolves around our Indigenous peoples and residential schooling. And we belong to the Anglican Church in Canada, which basically came here and ran these schools and subjugated these people and tried to beat their culture out of them. So it's, the countries may be different, the context may be slightly different, but the reality is, this white supremacist attitude is something the church has propped up. I wonder if you can share more about that and that sort of premise, that it's not just about rooting out the odd racist here and there. It's about getting down to the very core of the matter, that we've actually been one of the most egregious examples of how to hold the whole thing up.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important maybe to unpack the word white supremacy a little bit. Right here, because I think many contemporary white Christians hear that word and think, well, that doesn't really have anything to do with me.
That's right.
Those are people in white sheets and burning crosses and throwing bricks at civil rights workers and lynching people, and like that's not me or anybody I know.
Right.
And so I'm going to borrow a term from Professor Eddie Glaude from Princeton. It's a great way of putting it. He said, what we need to do is talk about white supremacy without all the bluster.
Yes.
Is kind of the way he put it. And it is this kind of more, I guess, common everyday sense that is so in front of us that it's kind of surprising that any of us could actually, with a straight face, try to even deny its existence, right? It goes exactly what you're saying. You could trace it at least back to the 15th century, with this doctrine of discovery,
right,
which is really at the heart of so much mischief, that really basically in a nutshell said, look, if any Western European Christians come across any lands that are occupied by people who are not Christian, they're free for the taking, right? And if you interrogate that just a little bit more and say, well, goodness me, like, why would that be justified?
Right.
And you really ask that question. The answer is because God had created white Europeans as a superior race, and their mission was not only to spread the gospel, but to spread, Western civilization right across the globe. And they were divinely ordained to be at the top of that pyramid, and they had a special mission then to kind of help spread the truth and Western civilization spread the gospel and Western civilization across the globe. And so but what's underneath all that is this very hierarchical worldview with white Europeans at the top of the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy, and other Black and brown people around the world kind of somewhere below that. And there was a ton of work, both in Christian circles and in early anthropology, of kind of trying to justify and categorize like all human beings in all these hierarchical ways. But that assumption, right, lands on American shores, on North American shores, both Canadian and U.S. It absolutely justifies, all the Indian removal acts, as they were called in the U.S., and the sort of just systematic removal of the indigenous populations onto reservations. And as you said, and then setting up things like English schools that force people to wear European dress, force them to speak English, force them to give up their native religion, right? All about kind of basically turning them into good white European Christians. I mean, that was the goal.
Yeah.
And so we got to take that seriously as not some kind of weird anachronistic thing back there, but as something that was a fundamental commitment of Christianity, right, from its inception, both Catholic and Protestant. And that we bring that forward with very little critique. I mean, and certainly in the US, it was operative, well into the 1960s, overtly, right? And then it kind of goes a little underground, after the civil rights movement. I think it goes a little silent, but it's never been deconstructed. I think that's the real key. It's never fully been acknowledged in modern times and never really fully been deconstructed.
More of your book, it's really part memoir as well. And you've been pretty honest in the book about your own lived experience. I wanted to read a little quote from it and then get your reflection on your context growing up. You write in the book, those of us who have grown up under the protective canopy of white Christian America need to tell a more truthful story about our own lives, both in the present and the past. My own experience has been that it has taken first an openness to the possible existence of a different story and only a modest amount of initial effort. A week of daily journaling, for example, before the light shifts, the forgotten or repressed stories begin to emerge and the scenery transforms slowly. Then it takes some digging with enough conviction and curiosity to overcome the inevitable defensiveness that rears its head as the veneer of innocence encasing treasured family lore begins to chip away. But while there is anxiety and even some shame and terror in recovering a truer narrative about ourselves, there is also something far more valuable, the possibility of a return to health, with these painful revelations serving as the first signposts marking the path out of what can only be called a kind of self-induced insanity. Can you share a little more, Robbie, about what it was like for you growing up Baptist in the South and that context?
Yeah. I wrote those words, I think, trying to, it's often hard to reflect on your own path, your own journey, and just trying to you were at one point you were at point A and now you're at point B. It's always not always clear how you got from one point to the other. So I think it was part of this book was really trying to figure out okay, I know I've moved. How have I moved? Why have I moved? What do I see now that I didn't see? And how did that happen? This is part of that, just kind of getting clear about that story. The other thing I didn't write in there, but I think that informed it is I had a bout with cancer about 10 years ago. And, the experience of going through surgery and chemotherapy, right? These, especially the chemotherapy part, I found I didn't make it too overt in the book, but this idea that you have to go through this kind of painful treatment to get to health. And you can kind of pretend like you don't have to, but you're going to die, if you don't do that. But it's really unpleasant. It's painful. Sometimes you feel like you're going to die, even if you're not, and I think it was partially that experience too, of realizing okay, we have become so ill by kicking this can down the road for generation after generation after generation, that it really is going to take something like a cultural equivalent or a theological equivalent of chemotherapy to kill all those cells, right? In order to kind of bring us back to health. And it's going to be a difficult and painful journey. But I think the thing that's often missed, I think, particularly talking among white Christians, is that, okay, like this is just a self-flagellation exercise that we have to do to kind of atone for the past, but there's nothing in it for us, I think is the mistake, right? That's often like, we're just going to pay the sins for fathers and grandfathers, but we're not, it doesn't help us really. And I think that's the biggest missed thing for white Christians, is that no, like what a great, in some ways, like an opportunity we have in front of us, particularly if we're thinking about, our place in a long chain of tradition, that so we receive certain things, they're in our hands while we're here on the planet, and then we hand them on to our kids and our grandchildren in communities. And, I think we've got an opportunity here in front of us to kind of do some work so that the thing that we hand down to our kids and grandkids isn't so encumbered by white supremacy, right? In a way that I think, because the awareness hasn't been there, and I think, again, there's culpability in that awareness not being there, but nonetheless, at least in this current context, it is out there on the table. I mean, this kind of moment of reckoning is upon us. And we can choose to push it back down, and I think try to do that. But I think we also have an opportunity to choose in a way. I mean, even the fact that we're talking about white supremacy, that word is something that people are actually talking about, I think is something different than even a couple of years ago. I mean, it would have been a much more difficult conversation. So I guess I'm hopeful that kind of what's coming up for me as you read that is like, just kind of this appealing to folks to say, look, this is about restoring our own health. Like, absolutely, it's about repairing the damage we've done, particularly in relationship with our African-American and indigenous brothers and sisters. But in some ways, it can even be a selfish project. I mean, we've got our own benefit to reap out of this if we do it right.
So in your own experience, like, you were saying growing up in Mississippi, and I'm just thinking, I mean, we're all the same generation here. I mean, so the thought of schools being integrated during your time is sort of shocking, until I stopped to think that Indigenous people in Canada weren't granted the right to vote as citizens until the 60s. Then all of a sudden, our ability in Canada to get self-righteous about such things gets slapped back pretty quick. But I wonder if you can share a little bit about your own family and some of the stories you tell in the book, because I think it's profound to know that you've made this journey yourself.
Sure. I mean, so I do try at the end of the book, because I am, I'm taking really a cue here from, and I've been really heavily influenced by James Baldwin and his writing on race, really more than 50 years ago. And he had such an emphasis on, he saw his own work as a kind of bearing witness. I mean, it was really a theological way of thinking about what he was up to when he was writing on race in the American context in particular. And so I try to think of my own work as kind of bearing witness, not only to my own experiences, but to what I can see from, my purchase of social science data and the like. But in retelling my own, so part of that was retelling my own family's story. And, I try to think about, how far back can I go with some confidence? And it does, in fact, begin with Indigenous people. I mean, that's where my family story begins, in Georgia. So we can trace our family back 6 generations into Georgia. And how do we get into Georgia? Well, we get there because one of my ancestors on my mother's side was a foot soldier in the Revolutionary War. And if you served in the Revolutionary War, you were eligible to enter a land lottery in the late 1700s and early 1800s to get newly opened land in Georgia, right? Well, where did that land come from? It came from Cherokee Native Americans, right? And so the Indian Removal Act pushes them off the land, and then they carve it up into 200-acre squares for white settlers, right? To kind of take their place. And so that's that's how we get to Georgia. We win a parcel, a 200-acre parcel of land in the land lottery. We moved down around the turn of the 1800s. And I have like passed down from my mom's side. It's in my library at home. our family Bible from 1815 that has
Yeah,
that first generation's, marriages, births, deaths right there in those pages between the Old and New
Yeah.
Testaments,
Yeah.
all handwritten, in this kind of
Yeah.
brown oxidized ink.
Yeah.
And so that's the beginning story, right? And then, also, noting that we weren't the kind of gone with the wind plantation owners. I mean, we had 200 acres,
Yeah.
and today we would have probably been classified as kind of, lower middle class, little bit more than subsistence farmers, right? So,
Right.
and one of the reasons why I know that is that my sixth grade uncle, who's named Pleasant Moon, that's a British name, not a
Pleasant Moon.
Native American. Pleasant
Yeah.
Moon,
Wow.
yes.
Yeah.
But Moon is British. Was had when he died, they did his inventory of his estate, and so they literally list everything down to like one mare, one wagon, one kitchen table, 6 chairs. I mean, it's that
Wow.
detailed,
Yeah.
of an estate. And his whole estate only added up to $50,000 in today's money,
Wow.
right? So everything he owned.
Yeah.
But what was remarkable in that kind of very modest family setting is the existence of 4 slaves in that household, right? And that they were the single most expensive items in that inventory, and so it had them by name,
Right.
like Naomi, a woman, $175, Bird, a boy, actually she was 400 something, Bird, a boy, 175, and if you look at the the kind of percentage, they made up more than 70% of the assets of this, kind of modest family living out, on a little more than subsistence farm. So it just tells you how entangled, this was, not just in the big plantation owners, but all the way down the economic spectrum, and that was how, they made even a very modest living work was on the backs of 4 enslaved human beings.
Wow.
Yeah, I saw a lot of action on Twitter for Columbus Day. That's just passed it about this idea of wanting to, change it to National Indigenous Day or something like that. And when I hear you talking about that, parsing out the land, that was some free stuff over here for you. But yeah, somebody kind of was there before.
Yeah, and to
we
be honest, like I knew this story. Like I knew that I knew that. Well, I knew the part of the story I knew is that we arrived by being kind of winners of this land lottery. But honestly, before I really started doing work on this book, I didn't take the other step of clicking, oh, well, where did that land come from? Right. I mean, that was even work I did in the last few years to kind of go, oh, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of, we've been talking on here a lot through the summer with a lot of the guests we've had. I mean, the George Floyd murder opened up a whole lot of conversations. As you say, we're saying things on podcasts like this and everywhere. We talk about white supremacy and other things, which not very long ago we weren't talking about. And I think for a lot of us, it's been that we've talked about the veil being removed, this sort of apocalyptic idea that we're beginning to see things that I like the way you speak about it in the book, this sort of selective amnesia. And, you have a great chapter in here about monuments and all of what that entails. And I think that there's not only an amnesia in that, there's a constructed history that sort of, belies reality. I mean, it's just, so I think that just being able to see, like you're just talking about, and this is a part of, I think, all of us who are privileged, who have this white privilege, being able to acknowledge, oh, all of a sudden one day it clicked in. Where did that land, how did that land become free? Like it's that pulling back at a veil. And for me, I think it's an incredibly powerful way for God to break open a conversation. And I think the legacy of that is sort of what you're getting at as you come to the conclusion of your book. You say, perhaps the most important first step towards health is to recover our white supremacy induced amnesia, as we were just talking about. It is indeed difficult and at times overwhelming to confront historical atrocities, but if we want to root out an insidious white supremacy from our institutions, our religion and our psyches, we will have to move beyond the forgetfulness and the silence that have allowed it to flourish for so long. Importantly, as white Americans, and I would argue white Canadians, find the courage to embark on this journey of transformation, we will discover that the beneficiaries are not only our country and our fellow non-white and non-Christian Americans, but also ourselves as we slowly recover from the disorienting madness of white supremacy. The disorienting madness, I absolutely was captivated by that, because it seems to be like that disorienting madness for me is like it's a loss of the narrative of what it looks like to follow in the way of Jesus. Like the disconnect between what we profess and the way we follow this peasant Jewish cynic, this Palestinian, like we've gone from that to being that central tent pole, as you say earlier in the book. Can you say more about, you touched on this a few moments ago, but why this recovery matters so much to us who follow in the footsteps of Jesus? Why, how the positive affect that this can have on us in terms of a people who want to be, who want to have more integrity about what it is that we profess and how we live it out as disciples.
Well, I think that word integrity is a really important one here. Authenticity, integrity. It depends on whether we just want to defend, a faith we happen to find ourselves in, or whether we really are after the truth. And I think Christianity has really always been, Christianity at its best is about. I think. I wrote, so I'll back up one click here. I wrote a letter to my parents when I sent them the manuscript of the book. I had intentionally not sent them anything before I was done because I just wanted to make sure that I had everything in it I needed to be in it. And if there was any adverse reaction, I didn't want it to influence what was in, between the covers. We've had some difficult, but I think really productive conversations, since they've read the book. But in that letter, one of the things I said to them was, this idea that the truth will make you free, right? And that is so central. I think that if we don't want to be captive, to a distorted version of Christianity, right, that has been warped and disfigured by this a priori commitment to white supremacy. We've got some work to do, right? And I think we can think that's awful. We can also think it's exciting. I think in a way that because there's a way in which this moment has given us the gift of vision that I think even again, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, like it was hard to get purchase on. But I think it's right there in front of us, and there's a kind of effervescent kind of thing happening. To speak theologically, you could maybe talk about. This is a movement of the Spirit, right? And we can sort of move with it or move against it. But there's a movement here. I think that's worth kind of paying attention to, and capitalizing on, right? And kind of leaning into. And I guess the other thing I would say is that. When I've tried to boil it down and talk to them, one way of kind of thinking about this, I think also that helps with the defensiveness, helps with the difficulty, is to kind of make this like really simple. And I think if we kind of boil it down and say, look, it's really about, this is what we're talking about here is really two things. It's about telling the truth and loving our neighbors. Like that's really what it's about at the end of the day. And we can't actually do the second thing without the first. Right? We can't really love our neighbors if we're not telling them the truth, and not telling them the truth about the past, not telling them about the truth about kind of where we've been and how we are where we are. Like we have to tell them a more truthful story about that in order to even be in a position to love our neighbors, appropriately and responsibly. So I think there's a lot of positive, things to kind of be proud of, because I think there's a lot of shame here too, right? Is part of the problem, is dealing with kind of this sense of shame, like of not even wanting to go there because it's just so awful. But like realizing that, like, okay, well, there is that, but there's also a kind of pride in tackling this problem once and for all. And if we think about kind of being caught between, we hear the word a heritage a lot, in these debates, but if we think about being caught between our ancestors and our heritage on the one hand, the thing we don't think about as much is on the other side are our kids and our grandchildren, right? And I think we are in a position on this issue where we can either defend our heritage and our grandparents, or we can give a gift to our children, but we can't do both. Right. So we're going to have to like make a choice here. And I think that, the better choice is let's hand something healthier down to the next, generation. Let them look back at us right? As the people who did the hard work. And I think that's something, that you could take some pride in.
Definitely. Well, Robbie, so much to unpack. We don't want to unpack it all here because we want people to read the book. And so Kevin's going to hold it up again. We commend this to you, White Too Long. Robert P. Jones is our guest. And the other upside of the other book is The End of White Christian America as well. So certainly want to give a plug for those and hope people will take a look and do some reading and some learning and some reflection, and perhaps a few veils lifted in others' lives as they're reading your work. And we really do appreciate all you're doing. We thank you for your generous time today, for being able to sit down with a couple of priests in London, Ontario, and chat about this stuff. It means a lot to us. And as Kevin said before we went on and started recording today, we're certainly keeping you in our prayers and all of our brothers and sisters in the U.S. as you go through these next few weeks. So again, thank you for your time.
And to that end, sorry, go ahead, Robbie.
I was going to say we could use it. Thank you.
Well, and to that end, just remind folks that on Wednesday nights at 9:30 p.m., the Vicars Crossing is sponsoring a national prayer event, coast to coast in Canada. We have people participating, Canadians praying for Americans. We have great American faith leaders joining us tonight. It'll be Pastor Carl Day. This is being released on a Wednesday. So if you're listening to it on a Wednesday tonight at 9:30, Pastor Carl Day from Philadelphia, music from the Luminous Voices, a professional choir in Calgary, as well as our own Ian I mentioned earlier. So please take that in and join us for prayers. Next week, we've got Diana Butler-Bass. And we have Brian Zahn joining us, as well as Karen Gonzalez. So please plan to pick it up. And the other thing I'd invite you to check out of Robbie's work is PRI. Go to their webpage. The work that you're doing sociologically, religiously is critical work, and we're grateful for what you're doing.
Thanks so much.
All right. And just before we go, quick hello to our sponsors of the Vicars podcast that help us keep this on the air, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy here in London, and to our good friends at Molly Maid, where you can make your home a healthy haven. So that's another edition of the Vicars podcast. Thanks to Robbie. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here.
And we'll talk again real soon. We'll get Ian back in the room too in just a little bit. And remember, before we go, Kevin, to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vicars Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicars Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!